On that night, when the red moon awakened the dead, breaking the stillness that had reigned since they closed their eyes, it was then that the city heralded the beginning of the hunt. And the prey was the entire city. It was a dreadful night, a heavy rain fell. He fled from something terrifying, for people do not run from good. The man dashed into the first place he encountered that seemed somewhat safe. He had but one desire, for no one to follow him. One could not even imagine the horror this man had experienced, which is why he cared little where he stayed. Though this eerie church was very old, and he hadn't eaten in ages, he didn't even hope to find anything edible here. But he hadn't slept even longer, so first he wanted to find a place to rest and feel safe. Suddenly he noticed something. A massive coffin, right in the middle of the church that was far from human-sized. The man decided it was best to avoid it. When suddenly the heavy lid of the coffin creaked open loudly. Everything inside him went cold. Fear rendered his legs numb. The coffin could only open in one case if someone was inside. He decided he must have imagined it as he saw nothing with his flashlight. Then a louder sound echoed and the man's heart raced wildly. When he shone the flashlight, he saw that the coffin had indeed opened. His fears were confirmed, and there was definitely someone there. And that someone was right behind him, a hand placed on his back. The man fell to the ground in terror, his body refusing to move, unable to bear the fear any longer. Before him stood a very strange man. From what era had he emerged? Very pale, aristocratic skin, red eyes, fangs glistening. Suddenly the man relaxed, saying he hadn't thought there would be survivors here. The blonde introduced himself as Jerome de Vladstalker and asked if he had awakened him. The man apologized, though the fact that he had been sleeping in a coffin seemed very strange to him. Jerome said he must have slept too long. He extended his hand to the man, offering dinner, as he must be hungry. The man was unrealistically happy. He hadn't eaten in so long. Finally, something good was happening. Suddenly, Jerome laughed loudly and said that his meal was right before him, asking if there was any blood to drink. Suddenly, the man's eyes widened sharply. Adrenaline surged in his blood again. Jerome abruptly opened his mouth, revealing 4 fangs. But the man did not hesitate either and ran off screaming, escaping at the last moment. However, Jerome seemed only pleased by this. He loved to toy with his prey first. The man could not understand what kind of lunatic this was, but he knew for sure that he was insane. And he didn't notice that Jerome had suddenly appeared right in front of him. That scoundrel was incredibly fast. Did the man really believe he could defeat a vampire? He simply had to accept it. Suddenly, Jerome fell silent, for he saw that his prey was being bitten by someone else. Was he not the only vampire? Jerome needed answers. Who dared to steal his dinner? But the scoundrel remained silent, so Jerome had no choice but to drink his blood too. The vampire was typical, like from any movie, fast, mysterious, and flamboyant. But don't switch off. I assure you, this is not just a simple story about another vampire that fed on people. It was something more. Jerome bit this scoundrel. It was a special moment. For the first time in so many years, he finally felt warm and fresh. Blood? Suddenly, the vampire began to vomit, and before him stood anything but a human. It was the greatest disappointment. He expected delicious blood, but received something disgusting. Now Jerome had an even greater desire to drink human blood to wash away the taste of rot. He could no longer bear it and ran to his dinner. But when he bit, he realized that this too was no human. Jerome received another dose of rot. It was some kind of mockery. Panic set in for the vampire. Would he never drink human blood again? Out of fear, he quickly left the church to find another person. But his disappointment knew no bounds. He thought the plague had started again. Otherwise, it was impossible to explain why all the people had turned into some kind of zombies. Jerome panicked greatly. He ran through the city, searching for at least one healthy, normal person. Jerome lowered his hands and resigned himself to the fact that he was left to die of hunger. Never in his long life had he thought such a thing would happen. When suddenly a miracle occurred. Jerome caught the scent of fresh, warm human blood. The scent was faint, but still it was hope. Meanwhile, in the house across the street, there she was. She was the person surrounded by a bunch of monsters. A real bunch of monsters. Was she afraid? Of course. But she had to hold on to survive. The first monster lunged at her. Jerome flew at the speed of light to make it in time. He arrived just in time. Like a hero, the vampire smashed the window and flew into the room. He immediately looked at her. She was a human. Jerome already imagined how he would drink all her blood to the last drop. She didn't understand what to do, for this savior inspired no trust in her. Jerome first had to kill everyone with bad taste. She didn't understand what this weirdo was rambling about. The monsters lunged at the new prey while the vampire simply stood calmly. But then he showed all his abilities. He was stronger than any human or monster. And Jerome knew this. He felt his invincibility. But she simply could not comprehend what was happening, standing in a stupor. Who was this guy anyway? And why was he fighting monsters with bare hands? Meanwhile, Jerome dispatched all the monsters. He turned to her, saying he had completely forgotten to introduce himself. She stuttered from fear. Jerome called himself the child of the night, a vampire. But she didn't believe him. What nonsense, such a stereotypical vampire. This was definitely a scam. But Jerome didn't care whether they believed him. He craved human blood and openly declared it. She asked him not to approach her and to stay where he was. Jerome laughed, saying she spoke like someone who had faced death. He didn't watch his step, so he didn't notice the suspicious taut wire beneath him. The wire snapped, and Jerome felt something bad had happened. Suddenly, a torrent of fire poured over him. She said there was a trap, so she asked him not to approach. His entire body was engulfed in flames. How could he have fallen for it so easily? Suddenly, Jerome unleashed a powerful hurricane that extinguished the fire, and she was thrown back, hitting the wall hard. She was just an innocent lamb caught in the trap of a terrible beast. But Jerome did not understand who she was, for she did not resemble an ordinary, normal person. And indeed, she was not just a simple victim and could stand up for herself. So Jerome received a knee between his legs, just when he had prepared an omelet. Jerome was once again injured by an ordinary person for the second time, and she even yelled at him for ruining her plan as a vampire. What was he now going to do with these dead? Jerome was shocked, for he had just killed them all. How could one be so foolish? Zombies do not die from a pat on the back. Jerome asked if zombies were those people infected with the plague. She didn't understand what this weirdo was rambling about at all. She ordered him to listen carefully and explain that zombies do not die. They remain the same and eat people. So he should be glad they hadn't bitten him while he was fighting with bare hands. Jerome concluded that zombies were immortal, but there were a few ways to kill them: cut off their heads or burn them. However, the latter was now impossible. Jerome did not understand why they didn't just decapitate these scoundrels. She said that if it were that easy, she would have done it already. But right now, the vampire did not have enough blood to use his abilities. He had exhausted all his reserves. She didn't understand at all what blood he was talking about. Suddenly, the puzzle in her head clicked into place. Extraordinary strength, inhuman abilities. He had called himself a vampire when introducing himself. He was indeed a vampire. They were surrounded by a bunch of monsters, so she asked how much Jerome needed. She pulled something from her jacket and repeated once more how much blood he needed. Jerome's eyes even widened. He couldn't believe what he heard and said that just a sip would be enough for him. It was hard to believe, but she had no other choice, for she certainly couldn't handle the zombies alone. She extended her hand to Jerome. The vampire immediately leaned in and began his feast. This taste intoxicated him. How long had he dreamed of fresh, warm human blood? He simply couldn't stop. He wanted to drink it all, to the last drop. Their gazes met. She abruptly pulled her hand away, for it was no longer just one sip. Jerome was sincerely grateful to her. He felt strength coursing through his body. Now he could decapitate all these scoundrels, and it seemed that it posed no difficulty for him. In just a second, all the zombies were headless. However, while he was doing this, the vampire lost his vigilance. He turned to finish his dinner. But there was no one left. She had escaped. Jerome had been fooled again by a human. Surely he was not the best vampire. She was already a block away. After all, when Jerome drank her blood, she realized that he was indeed a vampire, thus far more dangerous than a zombie. Dealing with zombies was already difficult, and now there was a vampire too. Everything was against her and indicated that her time was running out. But she wouldn't give up so easily. That was not her style. Suddenly she heard someone laughing. That voice was already familiar to her. Jerome caught up with her. There was no point in running. After all, now he could easily hear her blood. It was her mistake. But how could she have known? Jerome asked her to bare her neck. Resisting was pointless. It would only cause her more pain. And besides, she should be proud to be his first dinner. Her end had come. Jerome would drain her blood to the last drop. Suddenly she asked him to wait, and for some reason the vampire complied. She wanted to buy time and decided to say that Jerome had eaten his last meal, as there were hardly any people left. But the vampire took it to mean that he should eat her as quickly as possible. After all, she would soon turn into an unappetizing zombie. She felt a wave of nausea at the thought that he had eaten zombies. Jerome himself had said it would be hard to find another person. So he understood that himself. Suddenly, the vampire pondered this. That experience with the monster had left him traumatized. It seemed that Jerome had truly fallen for her trickery. This gave her hope. She said she knew a place where there were other people. Jerome needed her to tell him immediately about it. But she wasn't that simple, so she demanded a deal. About a year had passed since the first appearance of zombies. At first, it was hidden under chaos and upheaval. But soon zombies appeared everywhere. It was nearly impossible to find people. There had to be a safe zone outside the city for survivors. She was headed there. Her condition was that Jerome had to protect her until they got there. Suddenly, the vampire laughed loudly. He found it amusing that such a small girl had the courage to set conditions for a vampire. But she didn't back down and told Jerome that if he was sure he could find everything himself, he could just kill her right now. After all, she had only one life to finish the job. Jerome looked into her eyes as if trying to find the truth there. She met his gaze, not wanting to reveal her fear. The vampire smiled and said he liked her. And he accepted the terms, but he forgot one important thing. He asked her name. She was Mina Quarterman, but asked to be called simply Mina. After that, they returned to where they had met, because Mina had lost her backpack there. Without it, they wouldn't reach the people. Jerome didn't understand why she was so anxious when she had such a wonderful vampire by her side. But in reality, she was more worried about him. Mina promised, but now she wasn't sure. She had to avoid encounters with zombies. Jerome asked if he should clear the area of zombies. But Mina refused, as protection didn't include killing all the zombies around. Finally, she found her backpack. She needed a radio to find out where the safe place was. But Jerome didn't understand what use that thing was. Mina still couldn't get used to being involved with a vampire. So she had to demonstrate this invention in action. After a few manipulations, the radio caught a signal and began to speak. But Jerome's reaction surprised her. He decided there were people there and thought it was due to magic. Jerome reacted like a small child. It was both cute and eerie at the same time. He thought he could drink blood whenever he wanted, like a lunchbox. The vampire started shaking the radio to get people out of it. Mina tried to shout for him not to do that. But it was too late. The radio emitted a loud screech. Mina got angry, and because of that, didn't notice someone was behind her. Jerome tried to warn her about it. But it was too late. The monster grabbed her. Surely the zombies had come because of the loud sound of the radio. Everything happened so fast. Mina didn't even have time to react before she was a step away from death. But then Jerome intervened. He saved Mina, just as he had promised. Jerome was so hungry that he was even glad for such an encounter. He asked Mina to give him some blood, as she had promised. But she didn't respond. She pulled out a weapon. Could Mina not handle it herself? After all, she had survived somehow until now. She wanted to prove to someone that she could do it alone. But to whom? Her hands trembled. She could barely hold the weapon. Yet there was only one zombie. What could go wrong? Suddenly, her head spun violently. Everything swam before her eyes. Mina simply fell to the ground right in front of the zombie. She had lost too much blood. Her body hadn't had time to recover. Jerome was busy with the rest of the zombies, and Mina was in real trouble. While she presented the impression of a defenseless kitten in need of a mother. How had she even survived this year? Suddenly, the zombie approached her and spoke in an entirely human voice, saying that there were still those who survived. The zombie stood up and remained that way for a while. Mina was in a panic. Her heart froze with fear, and her head ached from confusion. She clearly heard that the monster had just spoken to her. Suddenly, the zombie simply walked past Mina and continued on. She couldn't believe what she had seen. Vampires, safe zombies. Was she dreaming? When Jerome returned to ask if Mina was okay, he noticed that zombie. The monster was running at him, wanting to pounce. Jerome trembled with fear and covered his face with his hands. But the zombie passed right through him as if they were invisible and lunged at the other monster. Meanwhile, Jerome noticed that Mina was trying to get up, so she was okay. She saw that the zombie had attacked the other zombies, after which she fainted and fell. She woke up to someone calling for an older brother. Before her, she saw a blurry figure. But just a second later, she clearly saw the face of that zombie. She immediately struck him in the face with her hand. Only then did Mina realize what she had done. What was this scoundrel planning to do? Mina was tense. The only solution she saw was to take this zombie's head off. Suddenly, a human voice spoke again. It said that he was not a zombie. Mina now definitely thought she had lost her mind, as she understood the zombie's language. Then Jerome intervened, urging her to calm down. He said that George was not a zombie. But Mina was surprised that a zombie even had a name. Then George himself spoke. He asked her not to judge people solely by their appearance. It was true that he had been bitten by a zombie, but he did not eat people. He was a smart man. It seemed that Mina was about to faint again. No, she was definitely dreaming. This was just a silly nightmare. No matter how she looked at him, it was still a zombie in front of her. Mina turned to Jerome after a brief silence. She ordered him to get rid of the zombie immediately. What if he bit her? But the vampire was in no hurry to carry out this order. After all, George had protected her when she was unconscious, and it was thanks to him that Mina was able to survive. But Mina didn't believe him. She screamed that the zombie had no reasons. Jerome interrupted her, pointing to her arm. It was bandaged. George had taken care of her, and when Mina thought about it, she realized that her arm no longer hurt. Now her thoughts about the zombie had changed. And this place where they were, it was the second floor where she had fainted. It was obvious. After all, zombies didn't know how to climb stairs. So this meant that this strange man was actually not a zombie. But that was just nonsense. How could such a thing even happen? Jerome asked what they should do and suggested getting fresh blood if she wanted. But then George intervened. He said that Jerome had told him about Mina and he couldn't believe in vampires. But that sudden situation had probably stressed her out, causing her blood pressure to drop, and she lost consciousness. Moreover, Mina had lost blood. George said it was best for her to rest now. Mina immediately realized he was a doctor or just loved to sound smart. But it turned out that George was indeed a doctor, at least until he became like this. He understood Mina, as he himself couldn't come to terms with seeing himself in the mirror for a long time. But she was curious how he could still think like a human. However, George didn't have an answer to that question either. If it was caused by a virus, then it probably just hadn't penetrated his brain or nervous system, which meant he could have antibodies. Mina was in shock. Jerome was too, but he was generally astonished by everything. So it was strange that he even knew what antibodies were. But no, he didn't know and asked Mina what that was. Mina briefly explained that they could defeat the virus with their help, and then Jerome asked what a virus was. George rummaged in his pocket because he had something else that Mina had seen. He had a radio. The zombie also asked to go with them to a safe place. Mina was in a stupor, not knowing what to say and not wanting the monster to go with them. She wanted to take it back. But George said he would only give it back if they took him with them to a safe place. Mina was furious. Had she just been blackmailed? But she couldn't find a safe place without a radio. That scoundrel was complicating everything. Did she really have to take this zombie with her? But she couldn't do that. Jerome spoke of fresh blood, but if she lost any more blood, it could be dangerous for her. The vampire asked what they were going to do. But were there really any other options? They had no choice. Mina said to kill the scoundrel. Jerome did not expect such an answer. But it was barely a second before Mina lunged at George. The zombie was scared. He didn't want to fight. He just wanted to be accepted. He held out the radio so Mina would remember the blackmail. But this only irritated her more. She didn't like blackmail. After which, she swung her weapon at George, but he managed to dodge. He wasn't planning to fight. He was just apologizing. And everyone was shocked by this. George apologized for blackmailing her. He wanted to leave together, but not at that price. So he gave back the radio. Mina tried to understand the hidden motive of this scoundrel. Jerome approached her and reminded her that she had tried to kill the one who saved her life. Mina shouted that it didn't matter, but suddenly fell silent. She saw how much Mina saw in him, and so she asked him, why did he even want to go with them when nothing threatened him if he went alone? But the answer was very simple. After all, everywhere people would judge him only by his appearance, just like she did. They might even shoot him before he said anything. So if people were around him, he hoped it would increase his chances of saying something. But George really wasn't planning to threaten. He couldn't shake off the thinking he had when he was human. He apologized one last time, blaming it all on his greed. Mina asked if he was done apologizing, after which she thanked him for saving her. For if he really had been a zombie, she wouldn't be human now. But she couldn't just take him with her. She wouldn't gain anything from it. Then George said they should leave this place first, as it was filled with monsters. Jerome said he could handle it easily and asked Mina for some blood. George repeated once more that this wouldn't happen, as it was dangerous for her. Jerome was already irritated by this, but there really were a lot of zombies. Mina intervened in their argument as she had an idea. They exited through the window of the room where Mina first met the vampire. There were no monsters nearby, so she climbed down, followed by Jerome. The vampire said Mina was cruel, though he knew she was brave. But he didn't think she would use her life buoy as bait. Then she told George to distract that zombie if he wanted to go to a safe place. He had no other choice. Meanwhile, sounds of battle echoed from the building, as if something was falling and breaking. Jerome asked if they should help. Mina ordered him to shut up and just wait. Due to the zombies' poor eyesight, they relied only on hearing and smell. But was it really because of that? Mina thought George would manage on his own. She said that if this zombie didn't manage, it would slow them down. George heard this and repeated that he had already said he wasn't a zombie. He looked at Mina with sad eyes, which reflected all the pain he felt when he was called a zombie. Mina felt it. She felt everything but had to remain stone-faced. So she simply turned and walked away, saying they had no time to waste. But George seemed deeply affected by this, and he didn't know if he could go with her. Mina turned around and asked what they were doing. Didn't they hear her? She called for Jerome, then for George, and ordered them to move faster. The zombie stuttered with excitement, but inside he was very happy to be taken to safety. Did you think this was a happy ending? No, you were mistaken. For this was only the beginning. The worst was yet to come. Events shifted to a carefree past. Mina was running quickly to the hospital. She was in a great mood. She dashed into the ward just as quickly. There was her older brother. He asked why Mina was running, as she was completely out of breath. But instead of answering, she threw herself into her brother's arms. Mina was incredibly happy that they had found a donor. But this was just the beginning. Mina asked her brother to recover quickly so they could return to how things were. She knew they would be much happier now. Suddenly, screams echoed from the corridor. It was strange, as these screams somehow caused panic. The entire hospital staff was quickly fleeing. Who were they running from? Suddenly, the news came on the television. It reported that chaos was spreading across the country. The government called it a civil uprising, and they urged everyone to stay indoors. They repeated this several times, urging everyone to stay home. The radio announced that all survivors should come here, to the safe zone without zombies. At the moment they were about to announce the address, Mina turned off the radio. They were in some apartment above a store. A year had passed since she had been fleeing from zombies. They were almost at a safe place. Suddenly, someone screamed. It was Jerome. He fell to the ground and screamed. Mina didn't understand why he was acting like that. Jerome begged Mina to close the curtains. She completely forgot that he was a vampire and feared the sun. Then suddenly, Mina stopped and thought, after which she peeked outside. How would they reach a safe place if even if they said George had antibodies, they had a vampire who drank human blood? They would definitely have problems with this when Jerome pounced on fresh blood. Before they got there, she had to learn all the weaknesses of this idiot. So Mina tore down all the curtains. Jerome screamed. The sun blinded him completely. He begged Mina to close the window, but she had no intention of doing so. She was curious about what would happen next. At the sound of these cries, George rushed in. He immediately ran to Jerome to help him. Mina stood silently. George yelled at her to find out what had happened, but Jerome pointed it out himself. However, he didn't point at the sun, but at the pharmacy, and said it was terrible. So sunlight, crosses, and garlic, all these things were just stereotypical nonsense, not his weaknesses. Then why was he standing outside and not inside? George replied that Jerome said so himself, though it was obvious he hated those things. So these weren't weaknesses, but in any case, it would be hard for Mina to control him. George approached her and said they would need this if they were going to take Jerome with them. He handed her a blood-producing supplement. It would increase blood production in her body. Oh, he was so sweet and caring. And she wanted to kill him. Jerome, meanwhile, regretted telling them what he shouldn't have. What was her plan, really? Mina, she was just food. And as soon as they reached a safe place, she would be the first he would eat. They exited the pharmacy. Mina asked why Jerome was smiling. The vampire was scared he had almost been caught, but Mina had other problems. Right in front of them was a bunch of monsters searching for fresh flesh. Mina told everyone to prepare because they were almost at a safe place. Jerome knew this was just the job for him. He wanted so badly to drink the blood of all these people that he couldn't waste a single second. So he ran quickly to deal with all the monsters just as fast. But when he reached the zombies, they simply passed through him as if he were a ghost. Jerome was in shock. But then a large shadow fell over him. He looked up and saw a huge zombie mutant. Mina and George were further away, and the monsters were now closing in on them. If they were still alive, it meant Jerome hadn't managed to handle them. George quickly stepped in front of Mina and ordered her to stand behind him. Her independent nature wanted to argue that she didn't need his help. But he didn't listen to Mina and was going to block the zombie in front. George got distracted and completely didn't see that the monsters were already closing in on them. He prepared himself. Mina did too. But the monsters simply ran through. Mina was in shock. Perhaps because of George, the zombies no longer touched her. But she was mistaken. When she turned around, she couldn't believe her eyes. Jerome was hanging in the air, kicking his legs, while the huge zombie held him like a toy. They didn't know what to do or if the vampire even needed help. There were so many unanswered questions. Suddenly, the zombie pulled Jerome towards him, and he was about to bite him. What happens to a vampire bitten by a zombie? Sounds like the beginning of a bad movie. Suddenly, George sprang into action. He began to shout and wave his arms to attract the monster's attention. George wanted to buy some time for Jerome, but Mina didn't understand what he was doing. So she started yelling at George that he had completely lost his mind. The zombie said he had kept the giant's focus on himself, giving Mina a chance to escape. Mina didn't like that. What did he think he was doing? That he could handle the monster alone? However, George insisted that someone had to do it. Mina was in shock. She didn't know what to do. She didn't even know George well, and it frustrated her greatly. But she also couldn't just stand by. Of course, George didn't like that. But Mina ordered him to shut up because she had somehow survived until now and wasn't going to die so easily at the hands of a zombie. After that, she suddenly lunged forward. The giant zombie immediately reacted to her. She ran to the open hatch and began calling to the zombie to draw its attention. But Mina still had her doubts that the monster wouldn't fit through such a small opening. Suddenly, very loud sounds erupted. Mina's heart raced. Even George was in shock, all because the monster had smashed Jerome's head against the wall so hard that it left a large dent behind, after which it simply tossed the vampire aside like trash. But the worst part was that she was next, and Mina understood that perfectly. But she pushed in all her fear to the back shelf and called the zombie to her, even though her body trembled. The monster took the bait and charged toward her. That's what she thought, but the zombie ran off in the opposite direction. Now Mina didn't understand anything at all. The zombie was running toward George and was about to pounce on him, doing the same thing it had done to Jerome. George's life flashed before his eyes. He never thought it would end like this. Suddenly, Jerome appeared and struck the giant jerk on the head. George was shocked. He had already said goodbye to life. Mina also couldn't believe that Jerome had survived and saved George. The vampire's head was smashed, but everything else was fine. After all, he was immortal. But Mina suddenly wondered why the big zombie had gone after George instead of her. Suddenly, it all clicked. The little zombies had been fleeing from the big one. They were so scared that they didn't even pay attention to the humans. The realization made Mina's blood run cold. Did this mean that the huge zombie had been hunting for George? Thanked Jerome for saving him. The giant's hands suddenly twitched. Mina realized that things were very bad. She screamed that George was leaving, but it was too late. By the time she said the giant was hunting zombies, George had already been grabbed by the leg. The giant didn't wait a second to devour George, and he bit. Jerome flew far away, skidding across the ground. He got up, but understood it was too late. After all, everyone heard the sound of the bite and understood what had happened. What had happened to George? However, it turned out he had managed to escape, and the jerk had bitten his bag. George had managed to save himself, but there were still problems. After all, his leg was still held by the monster. He had to find a way out. But how? Suddenly, the bag began to tear due to the immense resistance. And that's when George realized it was his chance. He ripped the bag apart, and everything inside flew out, including his scalpel. George managed to grab it with his hand, even if this zombie didn't feel pain. As a medic, George knew that if the tendons in his wrist were severed, then the zombie wouldn't be able to use its muscles. And so, George's leg was released. He fell down. Jerome saw George fall to the ground and decided they were too late. But Mina screamed that George was alive. He got back on his feet. Jerome was genuinely happy that George was alive. But the zombie said it wasn't the time for happiness. They had to get out of there quickly. However, Jerome wasn't afraid and told George not to worry. This was an easy job for him. The monster charged ahead. Jerome prepared to take down this giant, but the zombie simply dodged him again. Jerome was furious that he was being ignored once more. But he wasn't going to give up easily, not this time. The vampire lunged at the back of the zombie. He was going to slice its lungs. Jerome had previously used his hand as a knife, so he was confident it would work. However, he hadn't considered that he had never used it against the giant zombie. His hand hurt unbearably. What kind of skin did this rock have anyway? But suddenly Jerome realized that it was due to his weakness. He shouted that fresh blood would come in handy right now. Mina was angry that this jerk Jerome wasn't helping at all. Now they had to hide and prepare for battle. She called George to run to her. There was no time to explain. He just had to jump. Suddenly, George's face changed sharply. He told Mina to look back. When she saw, she couldn't believe her eyes. A cop emerged from the hatch, aiming a gun at George. She added that these damn zombies were getting on her nerves. After which, she fired. Just as George had said, the person shot him without giving him a chance to explain. He fell on his back, his body convulsing. Two more people emerged from the hatch. The cop ordered Simon to protect the girl, while Orlando was to go with her. Simon approached Mina and asked if she was hurt anywhere but didn't receive a response. Meanwhile, the zombie continued to chase George. Jerome was trying to take down the zombie, so he didn't notice the police's arrival. But when he looked up, he was shocked to see the people. The cop addressed Franken, saying they hadn't seen each other in a long time, after which another shot rang out. Jerome also fell to the ground, along with the zombie. His body trembled and convulsed as the shot had been from a taser. The cop ordered Orlando to grab the guy, and Simon asked Mina if she was okay and if the shot had scared her. He explained that it was just a taser, which immobilized movements for a few minutes. But Mina was worried about something else. Were there still others in the city who had survived? She hadn't seen any living people in a long time. Had they all been living in the sewers? Just 3, or were there more inside? In her thoughts, Mina didn't even notice that Simon had been calling her for some time. He said she needed to pay more attention, as people ended up like this when they found themselves in danger. Simon moved forward, pulling out an axe, after which he swung it. He wanted to behead George. But Mina intervened, saying he wasn't just a zombie. He had antibodies. This information caught even the cop's attention. Meanwhile, the breath shifted into the hatch. Inside was a room fully equipped for living. The cop asked if George had brought the antibodies to the safe zone. He tried to prove it, swearing he wasn't a zombie. Orlando was shocked that this zombie could talk and asked if he could think. He began hitting George in the face to see if he would eat him like that, but his hand was intercepted. Simon stopped Orlando, saying it was rude. But that was coming from the one who had tied up the monster? Was Simon pretending to be the good guy? Then Mina intervened, adding that she had made it clear that George wasn't a zombie and demanded that he be released immediately. Orlando was angry that this girl showed no gratitude at all. Then the cop shouted. She called Orlando and just stared, not taking her eyes off him. And just that was enough for him to understand everything. Orlando turned and left, saying he was leaving everything to their judgment. Then it was Mina's turn. The cop apologized for Orlando's actions and introduced herself. Her name was Rochelle. She said they lived in these underground tunnels because the land no longer belonged to the people. Rochelle didn't know if there were more zombies like Franken, but these jerks couldn't be destroyed by human strength. All they could do was paralyze them. And she believed Mina's words, but it would be difficult to untie this guy. She wanted to object, but George said he was fine and advised her to keep a closer eye on Jerome. Nearby sat a vampire, calm and collected, but his desires were far from peaceful. Mina understood that they were in big trouble, very big. She wondered if it would be okay to tell them about Jerome. Would they even believe it? Mina insisted that they had to leave right now and asked to free George. Rochelle said they couldn't do that, as Franken was still outside. They had to wait until tomorrow. Mina began shouting that no one cared about this Franken or whatever his name was. Suddenly, she fell silent, for she saw that Jerome was not in his place. He had vanished. Meanwhile, Orlando was busy in the so-called restroom. Suddenly, he felt something. But then he continued on, thinking it was just his imagination. However, it was not his imagination. And Jerome was right behind him, a hungry vampire who hadn't drunk fresh blood in ages. When Mina and George realized that Jerome was missing, the others began to notice something strange as well. George told Mina to find Jerome as quickly as possible, but she knew exactly where that damn vampire was now. Rochelle suspected something was off, so she ordered Simon to keep an eye on everything while she planned to follow Mina. Meanwhile, Jerome was already anticipating that incredible sensation, that delight. Who would have thought he would encounter this person in a place like this? Finally, he had the chance to drink as much fresh blood as he wanted. Bon appétit! But at that moment, Mina burst in, yelling at the vampire. Orlando heard the screams, and when he turned around, he noticed Jerome too. He immediately shoved the vampire away. Mina arrived just in time, and when she got closer, she noticed something odd. While Orlando yelled at Jerome for getting on his nerves, Mina spotted a strange tattoo on his neck. Meanwhile, Simon was left alone with George. The zombie asked when the handcuffs would be taken off him. Did he really scare that guy? Simon replied that he had dealt with zombies before, but the keys were still with Rochelle. Meanwhile, the others returned. After a while, everyone sat down to dinner. Simon offered Jerome some food, but he said he had no appetite because he had seen something he shouldn't have. Then Orlando shouted that he didn't want to show him that. He had snuck up from behind. Mina spat out her food at what she heard and quickly covered the vampire's mouth before he could say something terrible. But everything happened as she thought. They could no longer stay here. Simon didn't lag behind, and seeing Jerome's poor condition said he needed to eat something. The vampire asked if he could give him food, to which Simon genuinely wanted to share. Jerome said he was pleased to hear that. Then Mina screamed and asked him to come over for a second. He held a test tube with red liquid and asked what it was. It turned out to be blood that she had prepared earlier and asked him to hold on to while she was with him. At the time when George offered her a blood-producing agent, he also suggested she take her blood beforehand so she could use it at any moment. Jerome was concerned about such a gift. Mina was outraged that he was disappointed much more than she expected. The vampire held it as if it were some disgusting thing. For one, the amount of blood was pitifully small, and secondly, it wasn't even fresh. While he listed all his grievances, Mina snatched everything away abruptly if he was so picky. Then Jerome began to beg and apologize, asking for the blood back. He drank it all in one go. Suddenly, he paused. Mina asked Jerome what was wrong. The vampire began to behave strangely and deceive, but Mina believed him and asked him to keep quiet. And then she left to join the others. Jerome was shocked that even Mina had a sweet side. She even took the time to prepare all this. However, she didn't consider that it only made it harder for him to restrain himself. Simon decided that they had both left to sneak a tasty bite. Mina denied this and then changed the subject to George, saying they would head to the safe zone in an hour. Rochelle repeated that they had already discussed this and that because of Franken. They couldn't go outside. Moreover, as long as they were with this zombie, they would always be a target. Rochelle asked if it was true they wanted to say goodbye to life, as they had come too far. After all, this place was not what it used to be. It was wilderness, where everyone was for themselves. There was no concept of law, so one couldn't trust just anyone. But then why was Rochelle helping them? Was she doing them a favor? However, Rochelle never did anything for nothing. There was always a reason behind it. And her hidden motive was George. She asked to hand him over to them, and they would accompany them everywhere. Mina was stunned and asked what benefit they would gain from that. But Rochelle said that Mina was not in a position to contemplate the plans of others. Moreover, it wasn't as if she was giving them a choice. Everyone aimed their guns. Rochelle said to hand over the zombie without any fuss, and then they would stay alive. And Simon and Orlando were just happy they could shoot someone. But Mina was not scared at all. She laughed. Perhaps her suspicions turned out to be true. She asked Jerome if he had any problems after she gave him that thing. And at that moment, the vampire understood everything. The real reason why Mina had given him blood. Simon said they didn't understand at all what situation they were in, still laughing, when suddenly his stupid face changed sharply and was no longer so self-satisfied. For right before his eyes, Jerome appeared. Finally, the vampire could indulge in fresh, warm blood to his heart's content. He collapsed to the ground along with Simon. The pleasure was long awaited, but it was worth it. Orlando even began to stutter from fear, but still tried to threaten the vampire. But there was still Mina. She knocked the weapon from Orlando's hands with a light wave of her hand. He fell back, dropping the weapon. And now his life was in their hands. Mina ordered him not to do anything foolish. Otherwise, he would be left headless. She asked Jerome if he could stop. But Jerome didn't respond. He was too busy. Mina switched to shouting and aggression, saying there was no reason to kill Simon. However, Jerome didn't listen to her. He couldn't stop, for by nature he was a beast. Orlando's blood froze in his veins. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. Jerome said he hadn't drunk fresh blood in a long time and thanked Mina for the opportunity to drink to his heart's content. Mina was frightened that the vampire had killed Simon. Rochelle asked what fresh blood meant. Jerome decided to introduce himself, calling himself a vampire who fed on fresh human blood. He explained that it was just like how humans fed on food. To survive, he drank human blood. Rochelle screamed, thinking they were just mocking her. Did she really have to believe this nonsense? However, her expression changed sharply when she saw Simon, whose body was simply shattering into tiny pieces and scattering in the air like dust. Only his clothes remained. Rochelle suddenly realized they weren't mocking her. And Mina was scared that Jerome had indeed killed Simon and she could be next. This stupor was taken advantage of by Orlando. He snatched Mina's weapon and ran at Jerome to finish him off. However, the vampire wasn't even scared. He simply stood and awaited the battle. He understood that it was impossible to finish him off. But this was not something where his decision mattered. And so ended the life of yet another scoundrel. Jerome asked if he could finish his meal. But Rochelle played cruelly and grabbed George, pressing a gun to his head. She threatened the zombie with death. But Jerome just laughed in her face. For he didn't think Rochelle was in a position to threaten him. Her partner was still alive. Orlando said he would finish off the vampire. How pathetic. However, Rochelle said it was funny that they thought he was her partner. For he was nothing more than a pickpocket and a criminal. And she couldn't care less whether he was alive or dead. But for them, it was different, and they hardly wanted to lose those antibodies. A pause ensued. George told Jerome that he would be fine. However, Rochelle pressed the trigger a little harder. Jerome silently watched all of this. Mina intervened and asked the vampire to calm down. But he was the calmest of all present, yet he didn't like it either. Rochelle said it was a wonderful decision and threatened that they shouldn't even think about pursuing them. And Jerome and Mina left. But they stopped when they heard a cough. Orlando was still breathing, but he wouldn't last long. Jerome asked what they should do now. Mina replied that they had to save George. Suddenly, Orlando spoke up. He said he knew where Rochelle was headed. Revenge is a dish best served cold. The scene shifted to the street. Rochelle was leading George somewhere. Suddenly, Mina appeared from behind. She said she too would like to know what Rochelle was planning. Then she saw that it was Orlando's weapon in her hands. But he had given her not only the weapon, but something else as well. Rochelle immediately understood what it was. Mina pulled out a photo. The zombie she called Frank. He had once been her partner. Mina demanded explanations for what happened and why she was trying to take George. Rochelle understood that she simply had no choice and had to tell. It turned out that his name was Karloff. He was her reliable partner and their leader. Franken was his pseudonym, and he suffered from a rare condition known as gigantism. A year ago, after the zombie outbreak, their department was destroyed. They all lost hope and fell into despair. They believed the world would crumble into pieces. Everyone, except Karloff, who maintained a positive outlook. He supported his people, insisting that those zombies were merely dead beings who could not think and wandered mindlessly. But they were different. They were living creatures who had a will to survive. Karloff managed to give them hope. The team regrouped and left their shelter, rescuing the survivors and sticking together for the entire following year. Thus, they gathered 40 of their comrades, and their numbers kept growing, held together by Karloff. Everyone followed him. One day, they heard a rumor that crossing the bridge would lead them to safety. Joy and faith in a peaceful future filled the people. They had nothing to fear. But there awaited them a vast, overwhelming number of zombies that filled the bridge. It seemed they had gathered there, knowing that people would come. Yet Karloff did not back down here either. They opened fire on those fiends. However, something was wrong, not as they had expected. All the zombies remained on their feet. No one fell. It turned out they were using other zombies as shields. Ordinary zombies couldn't be that clever. This marked the beginning of their downfall. They returned to hell once more. Yet the worst was yet to come. Karloff protected Rochelle with his body, and a zombie bit him. He immediately began to transform. Karloff told Rochelle to run as fast as she could, but she could not. Karloff began to turn into a terrifying monster, growing even larger. Rochelle could not believe this was happening, yet she thought her end had come as well. But Karloff grabbed not her, but the monster standing behind. It was a miracle that he had turned into a zombie, yet he still did not stop hating those fiends. Thus, he became a zombie, defending Rochelle by eliminating the dead around her. Only 3 survived. They had lost everything. But Franken walked above them. Rochelle wanted to bring Karloff back. But Mina still did not understand how George was involved in all of this. Rochelle laughed and asked how he could not be involved. Suddenly, at that moment, Franken crashed through the roof. Rochelle said they had finally found a way to bring Karloff back. Mina realized it was a trap and that George was in danger. The zombie was large and terrifying, yet she was not one to be easily frightened. It did not matter how big the monster was. If she hit him in the head, Franken seemed to read minds. As he immediately snatched the weapon from Mina's hands, she fell and hit her head on a rock. Rochelle grabbed George by the hair and said that if Franken ate those antibodies, which antibodies, Karloff would return. Then Mina realized how insane Rochelle's plan was. She tried to argue that it could not possibly work. But Rochelle did not care. She wanted to try. She asked Mina how she could not be curious if there were antibodies, or if he was just another zombie. Franken had already grabbed George by the head. Only seconds remained before the horrific event. Rochelle lost her sanity, speaking to the zombie as if he understood her, pleading for him to return to her. Franken had already opened his maw to feast on George. Mina screamed. She did not know what to do, or if she could do anything. She understood this was the end. Rochelle triumphed. Her insane plan had succeeded. Suddenly, Jerome appeared and severed Franken's arm. George was saved. Mina could not believe what she saw. Rochelle grabbed an automatic weapon. Then she opened fire on the vampire. However, something was not as she expected. Amidst the smoke that rose, Rochelle did not see Jerome there. The vampire repeated what he had said before, that it did not affect him. Rochelle could not comprehend what kind of monster he was. Suddenly, Jerome appeared behind her and asked if he could now enjoy his meal. Rochelle's body froze and the blood in her veins turned to ice. She had not felt such primal fear in a long time. Jerome was already anticipating what a delicious dinner he would have. Mina ran to George. She did not even notice how she began to genuinely worry and care for him. Suddenly, Mina's expression changed sharply. She began to call for Jerome. She pleaded for him to turn back. Behind them, Franken was about to pounce on the vampire. Rochelle was already rejoicing, thinking Jerome would not act. However, the vampire was not even frightened and did not budge. He waved his hand, creating a strong gust of wind. As a result, Franken fell to the ground face down. But the gust of wind did not just knock the zombie down, it severed both of his legs. And now Jerome could finally finish his meal. Suddenly, the vampire was distracted again. Franken could not seem to give in and accept his fate and Rochelle's fate. And she was glad, thinking the zombie remained because of her, to protect her. Jerome completely forgot that to kill a zombie, one had to sever its head. He promised to deal with him later. He could not let him escape after all the havoc the zombie had wreaked. But only after he finished his meal, of course. However, we do not always get what we want. Franken rose and struck Jerome with just one hand. The vampire was now far away. Rochelle praised the zombie for his excellent work. To be honest, Jerome was surprised that Franken still had so much strength. He was hastening his own death. Thus, the vampire was determined to do what he had planned, especially since it posed no difficulty for him. Rochelle suddenly realized that this fiend was a true monster and that she should flee from here. But suddenly she understood that her legs were trapped under Franken and she could not move. Now she was pleading with the zombie to get out of her way. Jerome enjoyed all of this. Such amusing games lifted his spirits. He swung his hand to finish what he had started. Rochelle realized this was the end and she would not get away with it this time. Jerome relished the moment. Then a characteristic sound rang out. However, what happened was not at all what the vampire had expected. Jerome wanted to slit the throat of not the zombie. Rochelle could not contain her joy. She found it very sweet and sentimental that Franken continued to protect her, after which she asked him to get out of her way so she could survive. Then her gaze fell on something else. Jerome raised his hand again to deliver another blow. Another characteristic sound. Green blood began to trickle down Rochelle's face. She turned her head and saw Franken's head rolling to the side. A grave silence fell. Even Mina and George froze. Rochelle could not believe this had truly happened, that Karloff was dead. She pleaded for someone to say it was all a lie. Jerome still had a heart as he allowed the two to say goodbye. Tears welled up in Rochelle's eyes. He was not just her partner, she loved Karloff. After which she began to scream at the vampire that it was all his fault. Then she turned her anger on George and Mina. She told Jerome to eat Mina and she would lead him to safety. The vampire said that in the end, people were just food to him. Mina could not believe what she heard. Rochelle stood her ground and called for them to go together as she had been to the safe zone before. So perhaps it was not entirely a deception. But there was one but. He liked Mina. He recounted that when they first met, Mina did not beg for her life like Rochelle did. She rather put her life on the line. Moreover, she mocked his life. But on the other hand, she also helped him. All those actions were Mina. Yet all of this was merely her choice. Wasn't it amusing? A person behaving like that with a predator who could devour her at any moment. Such types of people had the freshest and tastiest blood, so he had to keep her until the very end. Mina felt her blood freeze in her veins. Her legs went numb. She knew this, but hearing it live was difficult. Rochelle laughed and asked if she had heard all of this. For beside a monster like Jerome, they were merely food. Mina's role had been determined from the very beginning. She could do nothing. She truly had no choice. Rochelle cried after such a speech. Now she felt better and thanked Mina, after which she asked her to drink her blood quickly. But Jerome was in no hurry to comply. All because he was now uninterested, just a pitiful human. Jerome had already had enough blood. Rochelle was to be an additional dessert, so he told her to at least keep him company. Suddenly, Mina spoke up. She yelled at Jerome that she had had enough. She told him he should not treat people as if they were his toys. But this only amused Jerome that she felt sympathy for people just like her. However, it was not so. Mina was simply irritated by his behavior. Jerome asked what she was planning to do then. Did she really want to sacrifice her blood for this person? Mina was furious as she understood that her hands were simply tied. The vampire told her to do something about her irresponsible sense of justice. He added that he had lost interest in this human blood anyway. After all, he didn't need to be greedy when he had such fresh blood as hers. So it was better to head to the safe zone quickly, and there he would toast with her blood. A grave silence fell. George asked Mina if she was okay, as hearing such things was unpleasant and frightening. She had been prepared for this when she decided to go with this guy. To him, they were just food, and he couldn't be defeated by a sense of justice. But that didn't mean the situation she was in had changed much. She was always on the brink of death. That's why there was no sense in hesitating, just continuing forward. She wouldn't let him do whatever he pleased. Rochelle apologized to Karloff for leaving, but he stayed with her until the end. Meanwhile, Orlando was outraged that this vampire couldn't even kill him properly. He was already losing consciousness, closing his eyes when suddenly he saw someone's body approaching him in the darkness. But then that body suddenly vanished. Orlando was scared that it was that vampire again. However, it was another guy who had overheard Orlando's plan and said he could help him. Meanwhile, Mina removed the bandage from her arm, and it was functioning well despite the wound. The cut had almost healed, even though only a few days had passed. She suddenly recalled Jerome's words that such delicious blood should be saved for last. What the hell did he mean by that? Suddenly, Jerome approached sharply, scaring Mina greatly. He wanted to know how long it would take them to reach the safe zone, but in reality, they were quite close. But Jerome wanted to get there faster. Mina picked up the rifle and remembered Rochelle's words about zombies on the bridge, so she should prepare. However, Jerome found it amusing. He said it didn't even impress him. Then George intervened, saying that the vampire might not care, but for Mina, it was a significant achievement. Moreover, their ammunition was limited. Then George said he would try to lure the zombies closer together so they could save bullets. Jerome listened as they discussed the battle plan, after which he cleared his throat, drawing attention and reminding them of his presence. He asked why they were so worried if they had such an incredible and powerful vampire. Jerome laughed that they could relax. But Mina thought that was the biggest problem. Jerome had enough strength to protect them, but if that strength was directed at her, then there would be no hope left. She couldn't just sit and wait for the vampire to harm her. Meanwhile, Mina was almost ready, having gathered all her things. Suddenly, she was called. It was George. He brought her food, as in her preparation. She had completely forgotten about it. She devoured everything in just a minute, especially after such a day. And she asked George if he wasn't hungry, if he felt hunger like a normal person. However, after being bitten by a zombie, all processes in his body seemed to have stopped, and he didn't want to eat or sleep anymore. Mina invited him, as under such conditions it would be much easier for her to survive. Her thoughts were interrupted by George, who said that his heart also didn't beat, and because of that, he was even scared to call himself alive. Mina suddenly stood up, and she handed him the stun gun that those people used, saying it was better for him to have it. But George didn't understand why he needed it. Mina said that if he ever needed to stop Jerome, he could use it. George also asked her to be more careful with herself. No one knew if he really had antibodies, so he had to think about the rest. He bore responsibility. And in that case, she would also think about the rest of humanity and go to sleep. This brought a smile to Jerome's face. Meanwhile, a new day dawned and the group reached the bridge.